Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Zoom Time Knowledge. This is a free public presentation series hosted by the James Madison University Lifelong Learning Institute. My name is Rodney Wolfenbarger. I have the pleasure of serving as director of the program. I'm also joined by Sue G, who is our program assistant. Sue's helping manage the platform, the Zoom technology today. So if you have any problems hearing or getting connected, just use the chat window, or you can give our office a call. Sue is there answering the phones. She'll be able to help you get connected and even give phone support if needed. Today, we're also fortunate to be joined by our featured guest presenter, Keala Timko. The title of today's presentation is Attracting Beneficial Insects to Your Garden. Keala is a Cooperative Extension Master Gardener who moved to Rockingham County in 2013. She enjoys sharing horticulture knowledge and gardening experience and specializes in ecological restoration, native plants, edible landscapes, insects, and food webs. She's been recognized as a Harrison Fellow of the Historic Landscape Institute of Monticello and UVA. And Keala and her husband Dave have been designing and are building their net zero home, and they are attempting to restore nearly 10 acres with native plants. Keala, welcome and thank you. And as we were talking before we added everyone to this meeting, about a year ago, our last in-person program was with you, and it was just a wonderful night out at Bricks and Columns. It was our first and only to date Wine and Wisdom event. And that was a success. I remember that night saying, you know, this was so good and it's likely to be some time before we're together again. But I'm glad that you're here and rejoining us today to revisit this topic as things are warming up. We're returning outdoors, hopefully getting our hands in the dirt, preparing our lawns and gardens. And hopefully it's not too long before we can get back together out at a venue like Bricks and Columns to resume the Wine and Wisdom series. But thank you for being part of Zoom Time Knowledge. At this point, I'll turn it over to you. And I understand you have some slides that you want to share. If you need any help, Sue and I will be in the background.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for the warm welcome and thank you everybody for joining today. Let me go ahead and get my screen up. Here we go. Come on. Oops. Okay, technical difficulties, but we'll get it here. Okay, let's see if we have it. Is everybody seeing my screen, Rodney?
Yes, everything's working. Thank you.
There we go. Okay. I want to talk a little bit today about beneficial insects. It's beneficial bugs here just because it sounds pretty cool, but beneficial insects. And I'm going to start off a little bit with a background of Virginia Cooperative Extension because that's where I have gained a lot of my knowledge and whom I'm representing today besides lifelong learning. The land-grant universities were established in 1862 through an act of Congress and have since been updated to accommodate changing needs of our people. And it's designed to take university level knowledge out to the general public. And that's what the Cooperative Extension does. They fall under the USDA and NIFA, and you can see at the bottom of the pyramid here is where I am as a volunteer. I'm retired. I don't want to be paid to do work. I just want to have fun doing it. And I love this. Several of the programs, the biggest one most people are familiar with is 4-H youth development. I fall under agricultural and natural resources, and I assist the agent who's in charge of commercial production horticulture in getting knowledge out and answering questions for the general public. So the biggest thing I ask people when I present in person, and I usually have very interactive and ask questions, so this is going to be a little more difficult since I can't get all of your responses, but we'll try this. Why do you garden? A lot of people do it because it makes their environment beautiful. a myriad of reasons. And, you know, my husband's at the bottom of the list. It's the honeydew list. For some reason, he loves to weed. And since that's my least favorite, I give him a list of places to go weed. And as you're gardening, this isn't something that we always deal with, is insects. But insects can be beneficial. And how do you know whether it's beneficial or not? And part of that is very independent upon the individual. A lot of people like insects for their beauty, such as the butterflies and some of the more colorful bugs and beetles. They think that beneficial bugs are pollinators, which they are, but they go way beyond pollination. And I look at my beneficial bugs not only as beauty and a pollinator, but as pest control. How do I get bugs out of my garden without using chemicals? And this is how I do it. How do you know the difference between them, and how do you identify them? So we're going to look at that. The biggest thing that all insects need is exactly the same things that humans need. They need carbs for energy, which comes from the nectar of the flowers. They need protein to develop. That comes from the pollen or eating other insects. And they need fiber to gain mass. And that fiber is what you see as the damage on your plants from insects nibbling on the leaves and sometimes the flowers too. But those are all required at different stages for an insect. And this is one of my native oak trees. And you can see I'm sitting underneath it, taking a photo up, and you can see some of the damage here. But if I'm not sitting under this tree, I really don't see that damage. And oaks are a host, the biggest host for all life stages of caterpillars and insects than any other plant, our native oaks. When you're trying to draw insects to your area, you need to make sure that you account for all 4 of the seasons. And you need to have some color in there, varying color, because different insects see different colors. And for example, our native bees are attracted to the pinks and the purples and the blues, and they'll go to yellows and whites, but that's a secondary color for them. Where we have other insects that only want to forage on yellow and white. So when you're providing a landscape for them, make sure you have a good palette. Make sure you have different kinds of flowers that are different shapes, some with the flat heads, some with the open heads, some with the bell-shaped heads, because all of the insects have evolved with different mouth parts for feeding, and they can only access certain plants. And they might try to visit another plant, but they can't necessarily pollinate it or extract any nectar based upon their mouth part. So it's good that we give them a variety of colors and shapes. The next thing is going native. Some of you probably know of Doug Tallamy by now. If not, that's a whole separate talk we can have. He's an entomologist, and he talks about how 90% of our natives are specialists on our native plants. In other words, they cannot go to the plants that we're putting in our landscape that we call ornamentals from either other regions, the Pacific coast of our own country, or from Asia, China, Japan. They cannot eat those plants, the majority of those plants, safely. A lot of them can extract some nectar from the blooms, but the rest of the plant is virtually useless as a host plant for our native insects. The other need that they have is, like us, water. And it needs to be shallow, it needs to have minerals. And this is where some people get a little bit grossed out. But and you don't have to do this, I chose to do it. Give them water. You'll notice that anytime there's a mud puddle in your driveway or off somewhere, there's a whole bunch of butterflies in it. And that's because that muddy water has a solution of the minerals from the ground in it that they can extract that are essential for them. And what I do is I have right here, you can see this is what I call my bee bath. And it is a 2-foot round rubber tub for livestock, about 6 inches deep. And I put it into the ground, and then I filled it with sand and gravel and a little bit of horse manure, because that's how it's getting the minerals in there that it needs. And then I fill it up with water, and then there's some surface plants that kind of grow into it. That way the insects can get into this water without drowning. And then they can take their mouth part called the proboscis, and it's usually a longer piece, and they can sink it down into that water and extract what they need. They need housing, just like us. They need a place where they can live. And 70% of our native bees, for example, like to house themselves in bare dirt. In other words, a section of soil that doesn't have plants, preferably southern facing slope, and they dig down underground, and that's where they live. And we'll talk a little bit more about their life habits later. Wood, the old pieces of log, branches, rocks, leaf litter. I'm a big proponent for not cleaning up your garden in the fall. Let the leaf litter and the stems be there so the insects have a place to be throughout the winter. Or you can buy one of these nifty little houses. And you can see here in some of these holes that the bees have taken advantage of laying their eggs in there and sealed them off. That's where you can see these lighter colored plugs versus the hollow. The only problem I have found with some of these is if I don't put chicken wire around the front of it, the birds will come and they'll start plucking some of the bee larvae from there for their meal. Here's an example of a stump from a tree that we found that was already rotting on our property. And I just put it out in the middle of the garden, and out of it came these nice little violets. Well, it just so happens that a violet is the sole larval host, in other words, the caterpillar stage of the Baltimore checker spot butterfly. And these popped up automatically, and you can see where they're spilling down the side and starting to root into the dirt. So I'm just going to let it go and be a ground cover. This is my bee bath in later in the spring, where you have the native wild geraniums growing into it. You have some other ground covers and plants. You have some of the native iris, which are just finishing blooming. But this also, you'll see the rocks, and the rocks are the place where a lot of our ground beetles like to be. It's important to understand the life cycles of our insects, and there's complete metamorphosis and incomplete metamorphosis. Complete metamorphosis is where the egg goes to a larval stage, or caterpillar, slug, all the same thing. Then they forage for a while, and then they attach themselves to the bottom of a leaf or wall. I've seen them on my tomatoes, almost anywhere, and they will turn into a chrysalis or a pupa. And they will stay in that form while they later emerge as an adult bug, and the cycle starts again. Incomplete metamorphosis happens when the egg hatches directly into a miniature adult. And you can see here it's called a nymph. And then they go through several instar stages, which means they keep growing. And as they grow, they'll shed their skins and they'll get bigger and bigger and maybe a little bit more colorful until they reach their adult stage. I always ask people, what are you going to do when you see this in your garden? And when I gave the presentation last March in person, there was one person that said, keep it. And I think one or two people said, oh, it's kind of cute. However, the majority of people said, squish that bug. Well, let me tell you, those of you who made the decision to squish, you just got rid of your lady beetle. And these are one of our valuable insects that we want in our garden. They're beautiful. Everybody loves ladybugs, at least that I've talked to. But it's also important to know before the ladybug reaches its adult stage what it looks like. This photo, and I will tell you, the photos that don't have the credits on them are ones that I have taken from Virginia Tech website. The rest of them are either mine, or I think I have one of our other lifelong learners who sent me some photos and gave me permission to use them. But this is a ladybug laying eggs, and that is not my photo, but the one down here in the corner of the egg mass is. So you can see that it's kind of an oval, almost a football, a little bit elongated football shape that you're going to find more than likely on the underside of a leaf. When they hatch out, they become the larva, which we saw in the first picture. I'll go back real quick. Larva. So that's what they hatch into from the egg stage. Then they forage for about a month. And in that foraging stage, they eat as much or more aphids and scale than what your adult ladybug does. So that larva is valuable. You definitely don't want to kill it, and you don't want to get rid of the eggs. After it comes, it goes, after about a month, it goes into a chrysalis, a small pupa, on the underside of a leaf. And when it emerges, it looks like this lower right photo where it doesn't really have any spots, and the color's a little bit orangey and dull. And then as it dries its wings, within 24 hours, you can start seeing the spots. You can still see it's a little bit orange. And then as it goes throughout the day, the next couple of days, then it really gets that nice bright red color and becomes an adult ladybug. What do they eat? How do you keep them in your garden? Oh, they're a workhorse. Aphids, mites, scales. You can see the list here, so I won't go through it. One of the things I like, especially in my vegetable garden, is the Mexican bean beetle, which I have an infestation of every year. And then I happily see the ladybugs and the toads sharing them. And then Colorado potato beetles. The question is, how do you tell the difference between a Colorado potato beetle, Mexican beetle, and a ladybug? Here they are. Upper left, ladybug. The other one right here, this is an Asian lady beetle. Down here is the Mexican bean beetle. And down in the lower right is our Colorado potato beetle. They're all of similar size, the Colorado potato beetle a little bit bigger. So when you see that really pale orange, especially if it already has black dots, you don't necessarily want it. Those are the ones that come in your house in the winter, and they do bite, which stings a little bit, but other than that, it's not all that bad. So this is your good ladybug workhorse that takes care of all of these pests for you. How do you get them to come to your garden? You plant plants that are called umbels. Umbels are like an umbrella. Think of an umbrella where the canopy of the flower creates an umbrella. Your dandelion, the seeding heads of a carrot, your dill, yarrow, and you can see the yarrow over in the photo here. You want to keep them as the winter. You want to be able to leave some stacked pieces of wood around. They like to hide in pine cones if you can just stack up a few pine cones. This is an insect house that I made, a bug house that I made, and it'll house a lot of different things. But you can see in there, I have some pine cones and stuff stuffed in there. And every spring when I clean it out, I inevitably find my ladybugs. Also in the beetle family, or the Coleoptera, meaning hardwing, are our ground beetles. And people will look at these and a lot of time they'll smush them. You really don't want to. Most of these beetles, the ground beetles, will come out primarily at night. They're nocturnal feeders. What they do in your garden for you is they take care of slugs. So I have problems sometimes with my carrots and my root crops, my turnips and beets getting eaten by slugs. So what I do is I make sure I have a stone in my garden. And if I put the stone, for example, underneath this squash is a stone. And this last year, I didn't have any problem with squash vine borers because I put stones underneath around the root of my planted area to keep those ground beetles there so that they could feast on those unwanted ones during the evening, or some of them maybe during the day, but mostly they're nocturnal feeders. They love evening primrose. This is not an evening primrose. This is a close cousin of it. It's a daytime primrose called Missouri Sundrops, amaranthus, and clover. And if you want them to stay around the whole year, you want to make sure that you have some logs or old stumps, something woody for them to bore into for the winter so that they can, and they won't go into the live wood, but they will the dead wood. This one, most people again say squash it. And I think that you're finally getting the hint that I'm covering mostly beneficial insects. So definitely not one you want to squash. This cute little guy turns out to be a lacewing. They're in the Neuroptera family. There are several different types of lacewings out there. And Neuroptera comes from the Greek. The PTRA means the wing, and the Neuroptera meaning the netted or veined wing. They're voracious eaters, and they have a very unique way of laying their eggs. They have them on long threads. So over here, you can see some other insects that are trying to predate these eggs. And it's very difficult because these long, thin filaments that the eggs are laid at the end of make it very difficult for them to be eaten by some of the other bugs on that plant. When they hatch, they eat a variety of our problem makers that are not only in our vegetable gardens, but also on some of our ornamental plants in our flower gardens and surrounding the landscape in our house. The adults, and you'll find this with a lot of the adult insects, is that they primarily eat the nectar, again for energy, the pollen for their proteins. And then the lacewings are very unique in that they eat a substance called honeydew. Now, earlier I said my husband has a honeydew list. This is a different honeydew. Your aphids and other insects secrete a sticky substance. And sometimes when you have an aphid infestation, you will see this sticky substance on your plant and the flowers or the ground around it. And this is honeydew, and it's basically the excrement of the insects. They poop it out. The green lacewings eat it. They're attracted again to those umbrella-shaped tops. And in my vegetable garden, this is a little bit earlier in the season. And yes, I'm kind of a messy gardener, but it all works for me. The more I have growing in here, the less problem I have with insects. And I just let the dill grow up and reseed and grow again. And you can see I left a couple of my carrots to go to seed, and they'll reseed for me. And then I won't have to buy carrot seeds and plant again next year because it's there. And in the meantime, they're attracting many of our other beneficial insects. Lacewings overwinter in the pupa stage, and they'll go underneath bark. So like if you have mulch or you have some loose bark sitting around, the leaf litter, that's where they're going to be overwintering. So another good reason not to feel like you have to clean up your garden every winter. Let it be till spring. The other thing is a lot of people like to buy these butterfly boxes, which butterflies will go into to stay warm on cool summer evenings. And this is a place that we have found lacewings to overwinter is inside of those slitted boxes. So it's dual purpose. This guy is basically called a slug. Again, it's in the caterpillar stage or the larval stage, and it's of a fly. And who would think flies would be beneficial? But they are. And I excuse my cat, he wants to talk. This is a fly, and this is a syrphid fly. And many of these are mistaken for bees because of this coloration on them. But flies, from the Greek, are diptera, classified as diptera. That's the order they're in, which means di, 2 wings. They only have 2 wings. All of our bees have at least 4 wings. Excuse me, I have to eject my cat. There we go. Okay. Here are the eggs of the fly laid on the underneath side. And you can see where some of them have hatched. And you can see all of these little aphids and mites and things eating on this plant. And these little slugs are going to go to work eating those various insects, the bad ones. The syrphid flies are also known as hover flies. There's tachnid flies. All of those are beneficial. Not only do they pollinate when they're eating as adults, but their larva takes care of many of those smaller things that are hanging out, making a mess of our garden. They like sweet alyssum, bachelor buttons, which is the picture to the left, and almost any herb flower you have. So if you're doing, feel free about planting herbs within your flower gardens, within your vegetable gardens, because they will bring in a good host of many insects, beneficial insects. They like to overwinter in crevices. So here's a stump of a tree that we lost and had to cut down, and we've left it, and they crawl in under these crevices of the bark. They go into the flower heads, such as the monarda that we leave over the winter, hollow stems of plants, the soil, And they'll even crawl into these rocks. We're lucky we don't have a bunch of rock outcrops here, but we have a bunch of little stones, and here's a small pile of them that we picked up that we don't know what we're doing with. But in the meantime, it's a fantastic location for frogs and toads and lizards and salamanders, snakes, which I like too, and insects to hang out over winter, hide. We're going to move into our bees, and a lot of people focus on our bees. In Virginia, the Virginia Department of Conservation indicates that we have over 456 different varieties of bees in Virginia, of which 20 are on the endangered species list, or endangered or rarely found list. And we need to make sure we take care of all of our insects, and that's where there's a great diversity of plants is going to serve more insects than just one or two plants. So here are a variety of them, and you can see our mason bee, how closely the coloration on it resembles the other, that fly. And you can see with some of them, the pollen not sticking just to their legs. Some of the bees have sacs on their legs which collect the pollen, and others it collects all on their body. This is a picture. This is a little guy who was boring into the wood when we were doing our home construction. And this is a carpenter bee. It's one of our larger bees. And the carpenter bee will bore almost a perfect 3/4 inch hole into wood. And once it gets inside, then it goes horizontally into that wood, and it'll bore 1 foot, 2 foot in. And then it'll start from the back, depositing the pollen it's collected. And you can see the pollen all over this guy. I mean, who could resist that face? Isn't he darling, or she? But they deposit the pollen back there, they lay their egg, and then they take some of that wood, sawdust, and they create a covering for that egg, and they keep doing that until the whole tube is filled up. Now, what's really smart about a lot of these bees is they'll lay their female, a bee can choose to lay a male or a female egg. That's a whole nother class. But the bees will lay the female eggs at the back of that tube. And then as they near the outer edge, they'll lay the male ones, because, you know, it really only takes one male to service several females. So they can afford to lose the males. So they put them closest to the outside. So they hatch first and mature and are ready to breed when the females emerge. And so that if there's any type of a bird or other insect eating on those eggs, they're going to take just the males. They're not going to get to the females, which are going to give the biggest bang for the next generation in reproduction. Our solitary bees as adults eat pollen and nectar. And this is a picture of a tulip flower from a tulip tree, which is one of our natives. And I see these covered with bees. This one's a little bit premature. They're mostly yellow. The solitary bees love flowers from trees, herbaceous plants, almost anything. They'll visit almost any flower in collecting their nectar, as long as their mouth parts are made to be able to extract it. On the left, you'll see some soldago, which is goldenrod. And goldenrod, of our native bees in Virginia, 13 of them eat exclusively from this plant. So it's important that we have some of the goldenrod out there. And you can see here, there's a larger bee here, there's a smaller one here, there's another one here. And that's just a quick snapshot I took out in the garden, and it was just filled with bees. The other advantage is it's one of our longest blooming plants. It usually blooms from about August timeframe all the way through October. And this last year with the warm fall, it was blooming all the way into November. They overwinter as pupa, again, in that pupa stage. And this is a picture of some goldenrod that I took actually Saturday when I was out walking around. And you can see that either it has hatched out, but this looks, because there's more disturbance here, it's not a real clean hole, like a bird probably put its beak in there and helped itself to a little bit of winter food too. wasps. Bees and wasps, everyone asks me, are they beneficial, especially when you get to the wasps? And I have to tell you, there are some that are beneficial. As a majority, our wasps are not aggressive. Now, there are a couple that are, and there are some circumstances. If you are nearing them while they are at their nest, which for solitary bees, they don't stay there once they lay their eggs. They're off. They're off doing something else once they lay their eggs. But your communal wasp nests will be aggressive if you approach their nesting site. So you do have to be careful of them, but they are very beneficial in pollination. And we're going to look at another category of wasps here in a second. So you can see these are some of the what we call mud dauber wasps, and some of them have hatched and some of them have not yet. The paper nest ones and the mud tubes, ground nesters. This is a ground nester, and these are some yellow jackets, and they are voracious. And something dug this up overnight. And I was walking around the next day and found this destroyed nest up in our wooded area. And you can actually see some of the bugs that got trapped in there, or they're going in and trying to retrieve some eggs if possible to try to make sure they're still viable. One of the biggest wasps that we have is called a cicades killer. And this year is the year of the cicades. And this wasp will dig down into the ground and they will eat the larva, attack the larva and use it. They will also go after some of the adults as they emerge. And you can see these guys grow about inch and a half, inch and a quarter, inch and a half long. And so if you see these around, they have a reddish wing. They have this really neat toothed kind of abdomen coloration. And they are, especially this year, going to be essential. I've already seen a couple of these out and about, and I've already seen some of the holes where they're digging into the ground, going after larvae. These are mud diggers, and they had just hatched out under a Cheonanthus, which is a fringe tree. And they're up here on this stem drying their wings. And they are also great eaters of other insects. And a lot of these wasps will actually go and sting a insect, and they will, when it stings it, it paralyzes it. Then they'll drag it to where they're going to be nesting, and they'll put it in that hole. So instead of packing it with pollen, they pack it with an insect, and then they lay an egg there, and they make that partition and start another cell for the next egg. And they do the same thing. They go out and get another insect, they sting it, it's paralyzed, they bring it back. Well, from the time that the majority of bees lay their egg to the time it hatches is roughly 3 days. And those insects are still in there paralyzed but alive, so they're fresh. So that when the insect or the bee egg hatches, the larva will then eat that insect alive. And that's how it gets that necessary protein that all young species or the younger generation of the species needs to develop into its adult form. This is an oak gall, and these are really cool. And you can see here, this one looks like it emerged without a bird getting it, but the wasp will lay its egg on the oak, and they're especially common on oaks. You can see them other places too. And there can be 1 to 10 eggs in there. And then they go through the egg form and they hatch, and then they come out and eat other insects. There's a category of wasps called parasitic wasps. And our parasitic wasps, you can recognize most of them because they have this very narrow part here on the abdomen, or you can see the very narrow abdomen, this long, what you call ovipositor. The ovipositor is what they use to lay eggs. This is what they do. Well, here, they come in all different sizes, anywhere from like 1/8 of an inch long to 1 inch long. So very, very, here's one that came in on one of my plants and hatched in my house. And of course I do a wasp rescue and turn them outside in the warm days. I try never to squish them. But here's what they do. They find the egg of an insect, an actual insect, the larva of insect, caterpillar, and they take that long ovipositor and they pierce that insect. And this is what happens. This is one of my tomato hornworms. I don't mess with them in my garden because the parasitic wasps will lay eggs on them. Those eggs will hatch out in 3 days. The caterpillar is numbed. He's not completely paralyzed, but he's numbed. He's not going to be eating anymore during those 3 days. And when those eggs hatch, they're going to consume that caterpillar. So I just supported part of the food web by letting that caterpillar stay on my tomato plant. Dennis Durast, who's also a lifelong learner that I met last year in a photography class, found out that I'm an insect nut. So he sends me insects to identify, and this is a saddleback caterpillar. And he found these, and you can see that this one is just full of eggs. This one has a couple small eggs starting to grow on it. This is what they look like normally, really cool looking little creatures, and they hatch out to be a nice butterfly. But this one is not going to make it, sorry. Parasitic wasps primarily focus on the larval stage of other insects. They do also eat or lay their eggs on the aphids. I think that was in one of my earlier pictures. So when you see a cool looking caterpillar, that's eggs on it, if it looks like this. The adults, again, when at the adult stage, all they go for is the nectar and the pollen. Parasitic wasps love the umbel flowers. So when you're planting flowers, do a lot of umbels. We do have some native yarrows. This is a cultivar. Our native yarrows are white. This is a cultivar of a native yarrow, which changes the color. It'll still be beneficial to some insects. Sometimes when you change the color of a plant flower through breeding or the shape of it, the insects can't use it anymore. So, but this one is fine for butterflies and your wasps. They overwinter as cocoons in yarrow, comfrey, your winter vegetables, such as your broccoli, your crucifers, your broccoli, your cabbages, your cauliflowers. And this is a cool creature. This is a praying mantis. And what you're seeing here, this is one of our 3 that are in Virginia. This is a Carolina mantis. We have a Carolina mantis, we have a green mantis, and then we have somebody we don't necessarily want here, but is okay so far, and that is the Chinese mantis. This is our Carolina mantis, and it is laying an egg case. And that egg case is so cool. It's called an Ootheca. And it looks like a long phone tube, depending upon which mantis is laying it. This Carolina mantis, you can see, it's all the same color, and it's longer and narrower. This is our Chinese mantis. This guy gets about 4 to 7 inches long. They are gigantic. This one was down near the barn door, and I was getting ready to go in and feed, and he was looking at me like I might be a meal for him. So of course I stopped and took several pictures. And you can see that they're brown with this green inset. And again, they're big. They're as big as a human hand. When they hatch out in the hundreds. And if they're in a location where they don't have other insects to start eating right away, they'll even eat each other. They love to eat grasshoppers. So of course I let them stick around. Other caterpillars, which I'm not always so crazy about, as long as you let everybody have a chance, it will be a bug world, and they'll do what they'll do. Here's the Carolina Ootheca laid on a blue spruce, and you can see it's kind of grooved and it's longer. This is the Asian or the Chinese mantis, and you can see it's a bigger bubble type thing, about the size of a walnut. And hundreds will hatch out. The nice thing about so far where our location is with the Chinese mantid is that they're not as cold hardy as our others. So when we have a good cold winter, we don't worry so much about them. They are big enough that they will eat a hummingbird and lizards, and it has been seen with them doing so. This is one of my final bugs, and this has to be my favorite. And I don't know why. Well, I know why, and I'll show you in a couple minutes. This is the second instar stage. This bug hatches out into, it's in the assassin bug family. It is a wheel bug. And it has these eggs that look like little cut off stems, or some people liken them to barrels, but they're all laid in a cluster. And this is on a piece of my apple tree. And then they hatch out into the regular bug. So it's an incomplete metamorphosis for them. This is what they look like when they're an adult. They're a wheel bug. And they get that name. There are many different assassin bugs. Let me tell you that first. However, the wheel bug is my favorite. And I think it's because of this cool little shield it has that it grows on its back. And because of what they eat. You can see its proboscis, which is its mouth part, is very long and it's jointed in 3 places. So it's very flexible. And as you look at its feet, it has this nice claw, so it can really get hold of things. This is another picture of one where you can see the proboscis a little bit better. And these guys will get 1.5 to 2 inches long. They're a fairly substantial insect. They eat everything that is going to be messing in my fruit trees. But this is my favorite. This is an apple tree. We had an invasion of Japanese beetles, and you can see the damage they were doing to my tree. Now, yes, it's somewhat cosmetic, but this year we lost another tree to the Japanese beetles that just completely defoliated it. So here's a picture of this guy. He's my hero because he has skewered this Japanese beetle with that proboscis, and he's sucking all the guts out of him. Oh, isn't that cool? So he takes care of one of my major problems, Japanese beetles. They're attracted to the shrubs, the trees. There you see goldenrod popping up again, a very important flower in our ecosystem. Wildflowers, and a couple more shots on the left of the tulip poplar flower. This is the egg case, and you can see some of the instar stages where they haven't developed that shield on the back, and they are also have a reddish color. So when you're designing for your garden, you want to make sure you have a variety of plants. You want to make sure you have some hardscaping, the rocks for those ground beetles to get under. You want to make sure you have some log pieces and flowers that are growing various seasons. From your early bloomers with lots of different colors. This is a sassafras bloom, one of my favorite trees, a red bud. So these are all starting to bloom right now. So they're going to be taking care of our early ones. This is a Carolina silver bell blooming soon. Into your summer with the Missouri Sundrops or the primrose family. You can see there's Monarda growing behind it and some asters, which will go a little bit later, some campanella. Oak trees. Again, if you plant anything, plant an oak tree. They're one of the best hosts for the majority of our insects. The yarrow, the umbels, the bright yellow, you can see I had some salvia growing back here that is just finishing blooming. A lot of the natives with the cone flowers, the oxeye daisies are growing back in here. The monardas blooming. We have some spiderwort just out of sight. Those are mostly natives. There's one that isn't. My granddaughter who goes, ooh, every time a bee flies by her or a bug flies by her. I think I have her pretty much fixed of that. She's 16 now, and she goes out and she picks flowers with me, and she helps clean the bug houses. So she's getting over her squeamish constitution when it comes to bugs. This is our wheel bug, again, on my cherry tomatoes, taking care of the aphids on cherry tomatoes. The asters, and you can see this is an aster that's been bred where the flower is a compound flower. So you're not seeing the inside of the flower here where the bees and the butterflies are going to go to get the nectar and the pollen. And you can see that there's sulfurs and buckeyes, and there's a whole bunch of bees on here. None on this compound bred flower over here, even though it's still considered a native aster, but it's been modified enough that it's not going to be used by the majority of butterflies and bees anymore. Water sources. This is just a rock outcrop we have, and you can see how the water collects here on its own when it rains. And every once in a while, if I'm thinking about it and I'm walking around, I'll take some water from my jug that I'm carrying and pour it in there for them too, just to make sure they have some. Bird bath. I put a rock in my bird bath so that if the insects come, they can land on that rock and crawl into the water just enough to get a drink without drowning. The old stumps, not only can you use them as planters for your flowers, but I have insects that are overwintering inside of these, under the bark and into the cracks and crevices of them all winter long. It's another shot. I put out a little toad house. I like toads. I'm a nature junkie. And rocks. Rocks are really important. They give the crevices places for our lizards, our toads, and our insects to hide, for a lot of our insects to overwinter. And then our stones that are going right into the ground for our ground beetles to make sure that the slugs aren't eating on our various plants. And that concludes my presentation. So I will take questions if there are any questions.
Let me get everyone microphone access here. Just restore it. All right. So we've restored microphone access. If you have a question or comment, you can unmute yourself or raise your hand. And I see two now. So I'll start with Sandy, who used the virtual hand raise, and then Pamela, I will take yours secondly. Sandy, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Oh, I was fortunate enough to go to see your presentation a year ago, and it was wonderful. But talk a little bit about ants, because ants are huge pollinators that most people don't think about. In fact, most mountain wildflowers and things are pollinated by ants. So maybe you touch on that.
Certainly. Ants are great pollinators. They're not one I necessarily invite into my garden, especially my vegetable and fruit areas, but we have hills of them up in the wooded area where not only are they pollinating a lot of the native wildflowers, especially the earlier bloomers, but they also disperse the seeds. For example, bloodroot is a plant and there is a protein casing on that seed, and the ants eat that protein casing and discard the seed. Right. But when they discard that seed, the seed is still viable and it spreads the bloodroot. And they do that with several different of our wildflowers.
Right. Violets
yes, the violets, they're fantastic pollinators. They're great decomposers of organic materials, and they are also great spreaders of our native seeds.
Thank you, because I always encourage them, because I have a huge section of wildflowers that I put into the backfield where I have it and woodland. So thank you.
I'm glad you're welcome, Sandy. I'm glad you brought that up. This is focused primarily at plantings around your house and in your garden, your vegetable garden. I have a whole nother presentation on insects and native plants way beyond this and what their life cycles are, because it's just so extensive to be able to cover it all. But yes,
thank you.
Ants are a pollinator.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Pamela, I think I saw your hand, and then we'll go to Vivian.
So my question is about garden cleanup. I purposely didn't, cut off all my dead zinnias and sunflowers and lots of garden cleanup. But when is it safe that like the insects that have been hiding in it are emerging? My daughter said that some special moth hides in the old plants. So when can I start garden cleanup?
Well, there isn't a magical day because our seasons, our weather's not reliable. And with this nice weather last week, boy, I was tempted. And then I looked at the forecast and saw I was going to get below freezing again the next couple of days. So I would say probably the way things are going, the middle of April is ideal. Now, if your flower heads, you're going to have insects in the flower heads still, possibly. But if you have the really long stems of things, if you leave about the bottom 14 inches, you're going to get the ones that are in there, that are inside those pithy hollow stems. Those can stay there and you can pull them later. Or the other thing is Go ahead and clean up those stems and flower heads and cut them off, but leave them in a bundle off to the side. Don't burn them, don't compost them, don't put them in the trash for a couple more weeks. So go ahead and clean it, but leave them stacked to the side where they still have a chance to hatch out and become adults.
Yeah, because I have a lot of, I think it's called pokeweed. They're real tall because the birds love those berries.
Yes.
And they need cleaning up. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Vivian, if you want to unmute yourself.
Okay, I have a comment about the saddleback caterpillar. It's important to mention that they have a really nasty sting. So do not handle those. As attractive as they look, they can really hurt.
Yes, that's true. And that's going to be the case with a lot of the caterpillars that have that same spiky structure, or the ones that have the, what I call hair, the long hair on them. A lot of those are going to be pretty nasty if you're messing
Thank
with.
you. Good to know.
You're welcome. And thank you for your comment.
Other questions or comments? We had one in the chat window, but you've already answered it. It was about garden cleanup. So it's good to know, again, timely information in the next few weeks. I think the answer was that you can begin that process.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you might have one more light freeze, but you want to try to get through the heavy freeze as much as possible. A lot of the insects are out there already active. I saw my first ladybug the other day. So yes.
Any other questions or comments for Keala? Karen, I see your hand went up. Let me get you unmuted. There you go.
I wanted to ask if there is a preferred kind of mulch to put on your vegetable garden that would be most helpful to insects.
Good question. I've used several different kinds of mulch, and last year I had ordered a huge load of wood chip mulch, and I had enough extra that I put it in my vegetable garden, and it's fantastic. There are a lot of insects hiding out in that. In the past, I primarily used straw. And again, I always make sure I have some rocks or stones of a good size in there for the ground beetles too. But yes, last year was the first year I used the wood chip mulch, and I loved it in my vegetable garden.
Oh, great tip. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sandy, let me get you unmuted here. You're still muted.
While you're unmuting her, let me add to that, the mulch, when I'm using mulches, wood mulch, in my flower beds and that, it's usually to establish a new area until I can get a ground cover. And one of the other things I did in my garden last year is, and everyone's gonna recoil when they hear this, I let mint grow in it, the chocolate mint, because it stays low. But boy, I had no problems with bugs on my tomatoes or my squash or anything. So that's called a green mulch when you're using plants to mulch with. So my big thing is that if I pack my garden as full as possible, instead of having the pristine plants of equal spacing, my garden tends to produce more and I have less problems with insects.
Well, I use mushroom mulch. That's what I was finding. And because especially in my perennial gardens, and then also in my vegetable and my herb gardens, because I find that it's very beneficial. It doesn't have anything I don't want in it, where sometimes, unless you buy really a good grade 3 times chopped wood mulch, you don't want pallet or dyed mulch at all, anywhere. And so,
Yes, because those chemicals will leach. That's a very good point.
absolutely, yeah. But boy, I'll tell you, that mushroom mulch is fantastic, and you get mushrooms too, which is cool.
I'll have to try that.
Karen, do you have a question or comment? I saw that your video came on and your microphone was unmuted.
No, I was just trying to be courteous to come on.
Thank you. It's good to see you. Any other questions or comments while we have Keala here and time to answer them? Okay, Keala, I want to say two things. One is thank you for your time and continuing to contribute in this way to our learning community. And two, I love when we have a member sharing expertise and knowledge that we can highlight that from within through programs like Zoom Time Knowledge. I know you alluded to taking classes, but to be on both sides of the learning, being the presenter as well as the student. And I think that's something that is just, I value as part of our community, that we can occupy both roles. And that's part of what lifelong learning is. But thank you again for your great presentation, timely information. It's always best when it's localized and given at the moment that you need it. Here in the next month or so, all of us are going to begin this process within the next few weeks. So thank you for your time, and everyone who's joining us. Thank you, take care, and hope you enjoy getting outside. Have a good day, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.